The house felt suffocatingly quiet, each tick of the clock seeming to echo through the empty spaces. Amelia stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, her hands moving mechanically as her mind wandered elsewhere. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, but even the warmth from the stove couldn't erase the chill that had settled over her. She glanced over at the dining table, where a half-finished crossword puzzle lay abandoned. The same puzzle he always left behind when he was too tired, too distracted, or too indifferent to finish it. She exhaled softly, her breath a mist in the cold kitchen. Her husband, David, had never been good at finishing things. He could start a project, paint a room, or dream of adventures, but there was always an excuse as to why it never came to fruition. He never seemed to notice the growing distance between them, never saw how she silently begged for something more attention, more effort, more him. Amelia turned her attention back to the soup, stirring faster now, as if she could shake the thoughts out of her mind. But they wouldn't leave. They never did. The nagging feeling that something essential was missing from their marriage had only grown over the years. At first, it had been subtle, small moments of forgetfulness, a missed date night, the silence that followed when she tried to talk about their future. But now it was glaring. The quiet despair had taken root in her heart, and David didn't even notice. When they first met, it was different. He had been everything she wanted, charming, attentive, full of ideas for the future. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The man she had married was no longer the man she lived with. David's smile had become more of a reflex than a genuine expression of warmth, and his conversations had become a list of complaints rather than the spark of intellectual connection they once shared. She had tried to hold on, to make things work, but she had never been able to reach him. Amelia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. David's tired footsteps echoed through the hallway. She didn't look up, not immediately. She knew he was there without needing to see him. The silence between them had become a constant companion. He entered the kitchen, his face drawn, his eyes dull. "Smells good," he muttered, his voice flat. She nodded, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. David nodded again, but he didn't engage. He dropped his coat on the chair by the door and sat at the table, pulling his phone out of his pocket. Amelia stared at the soup for a moment longer, then turned off the stove. She could feel the weight of their unspoken words pressing in on her, and though she had tried to make it work for so long, she was beginning to wonder, how much longer could she keep pretending this was enough? The soft ping of David's phone echoed through the room, but neither of them reacted. The tension between them lingered, thick and unsaid. Amelia turned away, her hands trembling slightly as she began to serve the soup, her thoughts already drifting toward the possibility of a future without him. It was in this silence that Amelia first truly wondered, was this all there was to life with David? Had she settled for less without even realizing it? The question lingered unanswered, but she couldn't push it away any longer. The next few days passed like ripples in a pond, small, almost imperceptible. But one morning, everything shifted. Amelia had just settled into her seat at the small coffee shop where she worked part-time when she noticed him. He walked in, his presence almost magnetic. Tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly confident, he scanned the room before locking eyes with her. "Amelia, right?" His voice was deep, warm, with a touch of familiarity. "I'm Jack. We spoke on the phone last week about the project." She blinked, momentarily disoriented. She didn't remember the conversation, but she nodded, offering a smile that felt stiff compared to his easygoing grin. "Right, Jack. Of course," she replied, trying to mask the slight flutter in her chest. Something about his ease, his quiet confidence, stood in stark contrast to the constant tension she felt at home. They settled into a comfortable rhythm as they discussed the project, a new community outreach initiative, something Amelia had signed up for out of a desire to shake things up. Jack had been introduced as the lead volunteer, and he was every bit the energetic, driven force she hadn't realized she needed in her life. As they spoke, the conversation flowed naturally, no awkward pauses or forced attempts at conversation. With every word, Amelia felt herself drawn in, her thoughts momentarily pulled away from the mundane struggles of her marriage. When Jack finally left, he gave her a warm, almost lingering smile. "I'll see you tomorrow. Let's make this project something great, Amelia. You've got the spark." She stood there for a moment, watching him disappear out the door, a strange warmth blooming in her chest. She hadn't felt like that in years. It wasn't that Jack was anything extraordinary, but there was a strength to him, a quiet force that radiated from every word, every gesture. He was capable, self-assured, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. Traits that David, in his easy complacency, had long since abandoned. The next day, Jack was there again, and again, they found themselves lost in conversation. He was different from David, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Amelia felt her mind awaken. Jack was passionate about his work, his life. He talked about future plans with enthusiasm, while David had long since abandoned any such notions. It was in these conversations that Amelia began to see the chasm that had quietly formed between her and her husband. The more she saw Jack's vigor, the more she resented David's inertia. By the end of the week, she realized something startling. She was looking forward to seeing Jack. Not just for the work, but for the way he made her feel. Alive, seen, as if she could be more than the quiet, dutiful wife she had allowed herself to become. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in far too long. And as the days wore on, a subtle shift occurred. She found herself comparing Jack to David more and more. His presence was magnetic, his energy contagious. With Jack, there was no hesitation, no waiting for a shift that would never come. He was everything her husband wasn't, strong, self-assured, and ready to take on the world. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like shadows at the edges of her mind, impossible to ignore. How had she not seen the difference before? How had she convinced herself that her marriage, her life, was enough? The realization left her uneasy, unsettled in a way she hadn't expected. As she locked up the shop that afternoon, she realized something. She didn't just miss the excitement, the connection. She missed the feeling of strength. And in that moment, it hit her with a weight that almost took her breath away. Jack was stronger than David. The tension between Amelia and David had reached a boiling point. It had been building for months, no, years. Each silent dinner, each forgotten promise, each unspoken word stacking up like bricks in a wall between them. But it wasn't until that evening, sitting across from David in their dimly lit living room, that she realized she couldn't pretend anymore. David had been talking about work, droning on in his usual monotone, but Amelia barely heard him. Her mind wandered to Jack, to his energy, to the way he had spoken to her as if her thoughts mattered, as if she mattered. The stark contrast was impossible to ignore now. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to her, refusing to be silenced. "I'm not interested in this, David," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, but her words clear and sharp. David paused mid-sentence, looking up from his phone. "What?" She swallowed hard, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm not interested in pretending anymore. In this marriage." The air between them froze. David's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? You've been fine with everything. This is just how it is." Amelia's heart hammered in her chest. She had never been this direct before, never this raw with her feelings. But now, with Jack's unwavering strength still fresh in her mind, it felt like the only truth she could tell. "No, David. I've been pretending. I've been waiting for something to change, but it hasn't. You haven't. I'm tired of waiting for a spark that's never going to come." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flickering with irritation. "Are you serious? We've built a life together. You want to throw that away over what? Some fleeting feeling? A crush?" Amelia felt the heat rise in her chest, her pulse quickening. This wasn't a crush. This wasn't a passing moment of infatuation. Jack wasn't the cause of her unrest. He was merely the mirror that reflected the emptiness she'd tried to ignore for so long. "It's not a crush, David. It's realizing that I've been living a half-life, that I've been stuck in a routine, in a marriage where I'm invisible to you, where I don't matter. David's face hardened, his lips curling into a thin line. You're being dramatic. You've always been dramatic. This is just how life is. We can't always be excited, Amelia. You knew what you were getting into. Her eyes stung, the hurt cutting deeper than she expected. No, David. I didn't know. I didn't know that you'd stop trying. I didn't know I'd be the only one holding us together. There was silence, thick and suffocating. David didn't say anything. He didn't try to apologize or defend himself. He just stared at her, his face unreadable, as though he couldn't quite process what she was saying. And for the first time, Amelia realized something else. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He simply didn't care. A wave of realization hit her like a sudden storm. This wasn't a conversation about saving their marriage. It was a conversation about whether there was even enough left to save. And in that moment, Amelia knew. The strength she had seen in Jack, the sense of purpose and clarity, it was what she had been craving for years, and it wasn't something she could ignore any longer. I can't do this anymore, David, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need something more. Something real. David remained silent, his face still locked in a blank expression. And Amelia, despite the heavy weight of her decision, stood up, the first step toward a future she wasn't sure of, but one she knew she had to face on her own. As she walked toward the door, her hand lingering on the handle, she felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. The silence in the house was deafening as Amelia stood at the front door, her hand still resting on the cold brass handle. Her pulse hammered in her chest, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions: relief, fear, guilt, hope. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something new, the clarity to move forward, to finally claim her own life. David's voice had remained silent, a hollow presence behind her, but his silence spoke louder than any words. Amelia's heart had cracked in their conversation, but now it felt as though that crack was releasing something she hadn't known she was holding back, a deep, unacknowledged strength she had long buried beneath the weight of her complacency. She exhaled sharply and stepped out into the cold night air. The street was quiet. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant hum of passing cars. She hadn't planned to leave, not really. The decision had come to her in a flash, almost instinctively, when she realized that her marriage had become a weight she could no longer carry. She wasn't running away. She was running towards something she didn't quite understand yet, but needed to find. The first few steps away from the house felt like walking on unfamiliar ground. There was no map, no clear path ahead. But the further she walked, the more the weight lifted. She wasn't fleeing, she was choosing. When Amelia reached the small park nearby, she paused by the swings, the faint light from the lamppost casting long shadows on the ground. She sat down slowly, her mind still replaying the moments with David, the disappointment in his eyes, the indifference in his voice. It hurt, of course it did, but it wasn't the kind of hurt that broke her. It was the kind of hurt that made her realize she had been sacrificing herself for a version of life that never truly existed. Her thoughts drifted to Jack, and a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. He had represented something she hadn't known she was missing: vitality, connection, strength. But he wasn't the answer, not really. The answer, she now knew, lay within her. The realization was slow, but undeniable. She had spent so many years blaming her marriage, blaming David, for her unhappiness, that she had never stopped to look at herself. She had forgotten who she was, what she wanted, and what she was capable of. Amelia stood up from the swing, brushing the dirt from her jeans. The decision was made. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, or if Jack would play any part in it, but one thing was clear: she was no longer willing to wait for life to happen. She was going to take it. As she walked away from the park, the path ahead no longer felt uncertain. It felt like freedom. She had no idea where she was headed, but for the first time in years, she felt alive, empowered by the strength that had been with her all along. And with each step, the world felt a little bigger, a little more open. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning.